Welcome. We're delighted to host the 2023 Mississippi Humanities Council celebration for the Humanities Teacher of the Year at Millsaps. We're glad that some of you are able to join us online, and I'm especially glad that folks have made time out of their day to come and hear the talk here and to celebrate in person. To begin, I'd like to introduce Evan Jones, a 2020 graduate of Millsaps College and a representative for the Mississippi Humanities Council. Evan?
Thanks to Dean Dunn. I'm really happy to have made it back to Millsaps for the second year in a row, and my second year in a row running the Humanities Teacher of the Year program. I'm really happy this year to be here to witness Dr. Wood's lecture because I had him as an undergraduate student about 5 or 6 years ago. It's easy to lose count with COVID years in the mix, I know. But if you're not familiar with the Mississippi Humanities Council, we're a 501c3 nonprofit that gets a mix of federal, state funding, and independent funding to promote the humanities in Mississippi. That can take on many forms, from giving grants to institutions like Millsaps. Oh, and I just saw Dr. Golden, our last year's winner. I just wanted to say hey, and thank you for your lecture last year. I really enjoyed it. It can take on the role of putting on lectures like this, hosting them, promoting humanities instructors all across the state of Mississippi, to awarding grants to institutions like this to put on specialized programs. I know we gave an American Rescue Plan grant to, I believe, the Millsaps Healing, Truth, and Racial Reconciliation Center. I may have butchered that. I apologize. I should have researched it beforehand. But enough waffling. I'm excited to hear Dr. Wood's lecture. And I think Dean Dunn is going to introduce him more properly.
Thanks, Evan. We're really pleased to partner with Mississippi Humanities Council, not only for this event, but for several things throughout the year. So thanks for that partnership. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today. Dr. David Wood joined the Millsaps faculty in 2004 as Chair of Modern Languages and Associate Professor of Spanish. David was actually the first hire that we made with tenure since I've been here, and that was an interesting process to go through. David was subjected not only to interviews with the search committee, but actually an interview with the tenure and promotion committee reviewing his portfolio. He teaches a broad range of Spanish courses at the elementary, intermediate, and advanced level. He teaches courses on Hispanic film. He earned a BA in history from Brigham Young University, an MA in Spanish from Louisiana State University, and a PhD in Hispanic languages and literature from UCLA. Dr. Wood credits his passion for learning languages to studying in Spain as an undergraduate. At Millsaps, he has led study abroad programs to the Yucatan Peninsula and to Spain. One of his main contributions to the humanities is to introduce English-speaking audiences and readers to the hidden gems of Spanish literature through research and teaching. Let me just say also that Dr. David Wood is among the most passionate and ardent advocates for broad liberal education on our faculty. It's always a pleasure to hear David remind us that a Millsaps education is much more than simply attaining certification towards employment, but it's important that we're here to educate for the good of society, and so that we create a more cultured, a more educated, and a better society for us all. So please help me in welcoming today's speaker and the 2023 Mississippi Humanities Council Teacher of the Year, David Wood.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Before I begin, I want to thank Provost and Interim President Dr. Keith Zen for his kind words offered today on the website and via email. I also want to thank Bill Story, Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, for putting my name forward to be considered for this award. Many in the Division of Arts and Humanities have received this award and continue to do outstanding work in their respective fields. I also want to thank Suzette Jennings for coordinating the work of the Office of Communications, John Sewell, Information Technology, Michael, and for the publicity to promote and live stream this event today. Thank you, Kelly, for the flyers. I also want to thank Dave Yates for Lucilius, Brian and Leticia for the last-minute translations of Azorin, and finally, the Mississippi Humanities Council for shining a light on the work academics do to promote the humanities. Thank you very much. By the end of the year 1896, a group of young Spanish intellectuals with literary ambitions arrived at the capital of Spain. Born in the middle 1860s and the early 1870s, this generation of male Spanish writers, as Azorin first conceived of his literary generation in a series of essays in 1913, consisted of Ramón de Valle-Inclán, Miguel de Unamuno, Jacinto Benavente, Pío Baroja, Ramiro de Maeztu, José Martinez Ruiz, who I will refer to as Azorin, that's his pen name, and even he included the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío. And there they are. Equally influential, but not identified by Azorin in 1913, were Joaquín Costa, Ángel Ganivet, and Antonio and Manuel Machado. Recent scholarship has, of course, expanded this literary field to reclaim works in popular culture and women writers that Azorin's essay did not take into consideration. Roberta Johnson's groundbreaking Gender and Nation in the Spanish Modernist novel, Maite Zubiaurre's Adventurous Cultures of the Erotic in Spain, and Christine Arkansas's important recent study, Spanish Female Writers and the Free-Thinking Press, all make significant contributions to broaden this literary field. And here we have a picture of the generation. Here is Azorin, Miguel de Unamuno, Ramón del Valle-Inclán, Pío Baroja, and Antonio Machado. And of course, a more inclusive list today, we would include Carmen de Burgos, Amalia Dominguez Soler, more writers from popular culture, Antonio and Manuel Machado, Ángel Ganivet as well. One reason for Azorin's exclusion of more popular and entertaining writers was that this work seemed to negate everything his generation stood for and was attempting to accomplish. Can you see that okay? Okay. On the left here, your right, is Miguel de Unamuno, who's pictured here as a stiff wooden figure, gazing, contemplating off into the distance. And then Retana, a more popular writer, wondering why things have to be so serious, but Unamuno had good reason to be serious. Rather than mere entertainment, here are more of the erotic novels that were published at this time that were disregarded by the generation of 1898. Azorin had good reason to exclude them because their work tried to go beyond entertainment. They wanted to offer new visions of a nation, more vital and creative. It proposed a new identity to reestablish Spain's former grandeur and prestige among European nations. Popular literature at this time, at least for Azorin, ignored this higher purpose. While reinventing post-colonial Spain was at the forefront of the literary and journalistic endeavors, they also expressed a fierce criticism of Spain's government and proposed numerous reforms. They were outspoken, articulate, and impatient with the government's inefficiency, complacency, and corruption, but exile was never considered. Traveling through Spain's old towns, they offered fresh visions of the Spanish landscape and medieval villages. They reimagined the Middle Ages as a unified time prior to Spain's imperial project. Drawing upon the works of Gonzalo Berceo and Juan Ruiz, they were inspired by its direct and vivid prose. As Robert Wool observed, they all felt intensely the isolation of Spain from the mainstream of European culture. All called for the modernization of Spain through action and will, and all looked back beyond the empire to the Middle Ages as one possible source for a renewed Spanish identity. In his 1913 essay, Azorin realigned his generation with the Cuban or Spanish-American War in 1898. The Cuban War, as it is known in Spain, was unpopular there, and Spain's humiliating loss in a matter of about 2 months intensified criticism of its restoration government. This crushing defeat for what was once a far-ranging and lucrative Spanish empire painfully highlighted Spain's military weakness, political problems, and lagging modernity, or in the words of Unamuno, Spain's maddening stagnation. Meanwhile, in the United States, newspapers would reinvoke the Spanish Black Legend, a smear campaign to attack Spanish rule in Cuba. After the war, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico would fall under the military and economic influence of the United States, who would also annex Hawaii at this time, while Spain's global influence diminished. Azorin's particular literary response to the political and social emergencies of the 1890s was to employ satire as a tool of criticism and reform. The build-up to the war and the war itself stimulated much satirical commentary through sketches and cartoons in both Spain and in the United States. Azorin opposed the war and believed it would become a fool's errand for Spain, whose navy and army was antiquated and national treasury depleted. On April 4, 1898, he published a dialogue between a patriot and realist in Madrid Cómico, a weekly satirical magazine published between 1880 and 1923. A patriot. We must salvage our honor. Long live the honored motherland. We must go to war against the United States. Raise the glorious banner of Pavia and Bailen. A realist. That war would be a disgrace. The Spanish soldier is the most valiant of all soldiers, but we have no money, we have no ships. How are we going to fight against a nation so much more powerful? A patriot. We will die in glory. A realist. Stupidity. Nations are not great for their victories or their defeats. They are great for their work, their industry, their commerce, their arts. Let me take you through a few examples of the satirical press published at this time. Here we see the title, La Fatlera del Oncle Sam, the craving of Uncle Sam. Of course, Uncle Sam represents the United States government. Here at the bottom, we see saving the island so it won't get lost. The United States government is depicted in two possible ways here. From the Spanish perspective, the U.S. government is greedy, taking what it wants from Spain as it begins to extend its imperial power. From the U.S. perspective, the island must be protected, saved, and liberated from the abuses of Spanish rule. And this is indicated here by the two kinds of hands we see, the large clawish hands of Uncle Sam. The right reaches out monstrously to grab Cuba, while the other hand seeks to protect those in the water swimming helplessly toward the shore. So the hands are the hands that save on the one hand, but also the hands that want to dominate and control and acquire on the other hand. This image here, Spanish search women on American steamers. This was an image by Frederick Remington, published in the New York Journal sometime in mid-February 1898. The New York Journal was a William Randolph Hearst publication, first iteration of what we call today fake news, the yellow journalism. Here we see Spanish officials mistreating women aboard an American ship. This drawing was based on a story that was told to Richard Harding Davis, who was the first American journalist to cover the Spanish-American War. Davis was returning from a trip to Cuba, and at dinner he was seated next to Clemencia Arango, who this woman is based on. She told him that she and two other women were being expelled from Cuba because of their support and sympathy for Cuban independence. Arango also had a brother who was fighting with the Cuban rebels. The morning prior to their forced departure, two Spanish detectives came to their home to strip search them for documents, letters, or secrets for the Cuban junta in New York City. When they boarded the ship, Olivet, American ship, at Havana Harbor, the procedure was repeated. The story was illustrated and crafted by Remington, whose drawing sensationalized the story. In the depiction, we see one Spanish man standing behind the woman, leering at her. The man in front seems to be here kind of mocking her. The man on the left searches her, and the woman just stands there, idle and helpless. The story and the sketch was a huge sensation, increasing Hearst newspaper sales and circulation, as well as creating more animosity toward the Spanish. Arango, however, the woman that was reporting the story, to the writer, was not searched by men, but by women. Davis defended himself, stating that his article never stated that the detectives or officials were men. Remington led readers to that conclusion himself. Often in the satirical press, the United States is portrayed as pigs and Spain as lions. And here we see a standoff between the two animals. Here, the lion perched on Cuba, immovable, not willing to give up any ground. And the lion says here in Catalan, no matter how much you snort to the pig, here he says to the pig, no matter how much you snort, I am not giving up my spot or much space. Of course, here the lion and the pig seem to be in a standoff over Cuba. On the blackboard of the Spanish marinero teacher, pictured here, who's instructing here, of course, Uncle Sam, the United States government, is a list of famous Spanish naval battles. Bailén here, the one that Azorin referenced in his dialogue that I read previously, in this battle, the Spanish army defeated Napoleon's army in southern Spain near Jaén, thus maintaining their independence from this foreign power, much like Spain wanted to do against Cuba in 1898. Note of the week, Madrid Comico. Here you see Uncle Sam here posing as Herodotus, the Queen of Spain, of course, as Jesus, and the pigs as the United States, demanding that Uncle Sam crucifier, crucifier. Le Rire, this is a French humoristic journal, and you see here the United States depicted as a strong, with their fortified metal ships, and here this very weak Spanish wood boats here made of wood. This brilliantly displays the imbalance in their military power. And finally, everything has been lost. Todo se ha perdido. The sketch was published on December 2nd, 1898 in the revista magazine Don Quixote. On December 10th of that same year, a peace treaty was signed and the United States officially ended the Cuban or Spanish-American War, transferring symbolically the sphere of influence from Spain to the United States in the Caribbean. Here we see the Queen of Spain, of course, weeping over the tombstone of Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. In the background here, we see the words Derecho Internacional, international law, printed on papel higiénico, which is toilet paper. Worthless. So international law didn't really help Spain to do anything for its empire. As a specific literary genre, written either in prose or verse, satire has enjoyed a long history in Western literature, beginning with Lucilius's social satire and then developed and altered by Horace, Persius, and Juvenal. And later in Spanish literature, beginning with the picaresque novel, all the way through to the romantic Mariano José de Lara. For Azorin in the Spain of the 1890s, there was plenty of material to assess, just as the Roman poet Juvenal had accomplished in his satires, observing in Book 1, it's hard not to write satire, for who's so tolerant of Rome's iniquities, so made of steel, they can contain themselves. In Juvenal's Book 7 of satirical verse, he addresses the misery and poverty of intellectuals, poets, artists, critics, professors, and the like. He does not question the value of their work, but only its compensation. All agree that their labor and works are truly appreciated and valued, but there's just no cash in it. Luckily, literature had a great patron in Trajan or Hadrian, but millionaires begrudge the money they owe poets while squandering their cash on useless, extravagant expenses like millions of dollars, like running water pouring through their fingers. Juvenal says, Numitor is too poor to send a present to his client, though he has a gift for Quintilla, a selfish rich man and his mistress, and he was rich enough to purchase a lion already tamed, which eats large quantities of meat. I suppose a beast costs less and a poet's guts hold more. What reward does your voice get, Juvenal asks, a tiny shoulder of dried up ham and a jar of tuna fish or ancient onions. But it was Lucilius who wrote 30 books of satire, of which only fragments remain, around 1,300 short verses that created satire. He was the first to employ it as social criticism aimed at certain social types and whose works once demanded the attention of all other Roman satirists who followed him. In Book 3, he compares a gladiator at Capua to a rhinoceros because he has a tiny projecting tooth that contrasts with his strong jutting jaw. He writes, "This jut mouth of Bovile, with his one little projecting tooth, is a very rhinoceros." Or he could take on humanity in general, comparing its ability to speak with that of a dog's snarl, the letter R, which a dog, when it is teased, utters more plainly than a man. Satire's shifting emphasis from Lucilius to Juvenal is not just generic adjustments, as Kirk Frudenberg has argued, but a generically encoded story of Rome's lost and much lionized Republican identity. Similarly, Azorin's satire will carry forward Lucilius's original impulse as social criticism. For both ancient Rome and the late 19th century Spain, satire seems to have arisen at a moment of national crisis, subjectively portrayed as a form of uncompromised and often aggressive communication that questions Roman or Spanish identity. Satire in Azorin's early literary works has not been properly acknowledged or analyzed, even though he proclaimed himself a satirist in the prologue to Buscapiés. Azorin ends his prologue to the text, quoting Quevedo, one of Spain's most well-known satirists. And Azorin's satire certainly drew upon the Spanish picaresque novel, as his node to Quevedo indicates. In Book 2, Chapter 1 of Quevedo's El Buscón, the Swindler, Pablos, the main character, sets off for Segovia, separating from his friend and boss, Don Diego Coronel, the son of a gentleman. On the way, he bumps into an arbitrista, an armchair political economist, who wants to present to the king a ridiculous proposal to capture the Belgian coastal city of Ostend by sucking up the water around it with sponges. Chuparle todo con esponjas. Pablos then asks the man how he will prevent the water from coming back. The arbitrista replies that he also has a plan to lower the sea level por 12 estados, by about 80 feet. Continuing on the road, Pablos comes across a mathematician who has created absurd maneuvers and angles for sword fencing based on mathematical computations. This mathematician fencer believes that by applying the correct calculated angles he has devised and published, which he has devised and subsequently published in his book, a fencer will be able to kill whoever he wishes. Both episodes, I forgot to show you this one. I found a little Juvenalian satire meme on the internet here. Are you proficient in Juvenalian satire? Because I'd love to have your tongue in my cheek. Juvenal was made jabs at various social types, including sexual types. Here is a good representative of the kind of characters Quevedo presents in his book, The Swindler. This is a painting by Velázquez. Both episodes I just described in The Swindler digress from the main plot, but make a political and personal criticism. The first mocks some of the far-fetched suggestions made to King Philip III during Spain's hostile struggles in the Netherlands that began in 1566. You're still awake, Priscilla? The second example illustrates how satire can become personal when authors attack each other, famously illustrated elsewhere in the literary exchanges between Quevedo and Luis de Góngora. In El Buscón, Quevedo ridicules Luis Pacheco de Narváez, who wrote a book on destreza, the Spanish art of fencing. Narváez also served as King Philip IV's fencing master. In 1608, Narváez and Quevedo engaged in a fencing match wherein, during the first encounter, Quevedo took off Pacheco's hat. In the novel, Quevedo satirizes both Narváez's book and fencing abilities as a character who ends up running away from a duel against an experienced soldier. Buscapiés. Buscar in Spanish means to look for, to search for. Pies, of course, is your feet. Buscapiés, published in 1894, was Azorin's initial attempt at satire. The title translates in two ways that hold meaning for the text to come. On the one hand, the title can mean firecracker, that when lit, this particular kind of firecracker, when lit, spins around on the ground, threatening to burn your feet. So you must watch your feet or watch your step so as not to get burned. I think of Azorin's satires here as tiny little firecrackers that had the potential to burn his subjects with the intention of sparking conversation or dialogue. The second translation has to do with conversation. Buscapiés can also mean the intention of the speaker to leave the listener worried or want to make others talk about something that the speaker pretends to be insignificant. So the speaker wants to check with others about the legitimacy of the statement that the speaker makes. The stories in Buscapiés leave the reader wondering if Spain is as sick or ill a nation as Azorin's satire suggests. I now want to turn to the text itself and take a look at two short stories that best exemplify satire's illness in Buscapiés. In Estaba Escrito, it was written, Martinez Ruiz employs a morbid form of satire to criticize Spain's restoration government. Its victim, Don Luis Maria Muñarriz, while reading the morning paper and enjoying his coffee, stumbles upon his own obituary published in the newspaper that he reads. The obituary occupies the first 7 paragraphs of the story and objectively describes Muñarriz's impressive career achievements. Muñarriz distinguished himself from an early age for his untarnished love for civil institutions and left a deep influence on the principles and policies of Restoration Spain. The narrator observes, a man of deep convictions and of great initiative, he was one of those who worked the hardest in the work of the Restoration, putting his interests and his intelligence at the service of the fatherland. Reading alongside Don Luis, we admire his long and dedicated service to the Spanish government. We learn that he served brilliantly in the civil government in Orense. Later, he was appointed as senior deputy of civil administration. His natural modesty prevented him from accepting a position as director of prisons, a promotion that may have offered greater benefits, greater pay, and which was offered to him by President Cánovas. Later, Muñarriz retires early after a serious illness, but he mustered enough strength to continue his historical research on Hispanic Roman law. The obituary concludes by mourning the loss of a political champion of the Conservative Party. Understandably, the character is bewildered after reading about his own death because he has not died. Who would have published this piece? Who would have reported his death to the newspapers while he is still living? Upon finishing his own obituary, he reclines into his easy chair, watching the smoke from his cigarette spiral upwards. Naturally, he begins to ponder his own death, his own real death. Don Luis suddenly feels younger and more alive than usual, as if he has cheated death. But then subtle physical symptoms of illness begin to appear. He had something that he was not able to explain clearly. However, that turned out to be nothing, just a persistent headache and dizziness in the morning. But the next morning, his condition worsens, and while arranging some antique parchments, he faints. His persistent headaches and dizziness eventually lead to a nervous breakdown. And Don Luis, shaking nervously and then, like an idiot, shaking his head from side to side, sunk into a stupefied marasmus, something similar to a death. These conditions become so unbearable, the well-respected politician ends his own life by shooting himself. Yesterday afternoon, the narrator observes, yesterday afternoon he committed suicide firing 2 shots from a revolver. The well-known politician of this capital, DLMM, who for some time had been suffering from prolonged illness. The story then concludes where it begins, with an announcement from the morning newspaper, The Information, regarding the death of this honorable civil servant. Martinez Azorin is playing with the idea that the same political system Don Luis serves also breeds illness upon well-meaning servants. The placement of the obituary at the beginning of the story, prior to Don Luis's suicide, suggests that the Conservative Party has already died before its adherents physically do. Don Luis's suicide was preceded by a slow developing nervous breakdown, presumably caused by years of serving the Spanish government. Although he performed his tasks well as a civil servant, he ultimately succumbed to the political environment in which he worked, forcing him into early retirement because of a serious ailment that ultimately led to a natural demise and then an unfortunate suicide. Estaba Escrito may be read as a criticism of Spain's governmental problems. By the spring of 1898, Spain was heading into a humiliating military defeat, and the Restoration government, based on the Constitution of 1876 with alternating power sharing between liberals and conservatives back and forth, became a charade of a democracy. The military embarrassment of 1898 would highlight a few years later the political incompetency and general pessimism expressed in Buscapiés in 1894. The war further damaged the government's credibility and raised more questions about its efficacy, especially for the suicidal civil servant to which he dedicated his life. It seems correct then to understand suicide in this story as a lethal consequence to an inefficient political system to which this character belonged. Objectively, Canovas did create a stable political system based on prestigious civil power in which people could trust. Martinez Ruiz's character, Don Luis, was one such civil servant who contributed to such a system Canovas had imagined. As the obituary attests, Don Luis was committed to the Restoration government. He dedicated himself to the work of restoring political stability to Spain throughout the last quarter of the 19th century, pouring his intelligence and strength into government service. Setting aside the weaknesses of the political system and bureaucracy Canovas created, the system did restore political stability, even if it excluded alternative political parties and trade unions like those of anarchists and socialists, who continued to expand their numbers in spite of official exclusion. Canovas was pragmatic and skeptical at the same time, which allowed him to see the function of the state in a way different from other Spanish politicians during the last quarter of the 19th century. But Azorin's angle was different. By the 1890s, the mood had changed and the early successes of the Turno Pacifico were fading. It was now doing more harm than good to those it had served. Vencido, vanquished, contrasts the self-isolation of a helpless painter with the larger Spanish society, and it questions the role of the artist in the growing bourgeoisie of Madrid in the 1890s. Luis Sanchez Francisco points out that the painter's search for an authentic style references Azorin's own concerns for a unique literary style and voice at the same time. This character also displays similar characteristics Martinez Ruiz will develop for his struggling writer in La Voluntad, the abulia, or the apathy, and the realization that making art and achieving artistic fame does not necessarily lead to happiness. A close reading of this painter in Vencido uncovers many traits of future artist protagonists in Azorin's novels to come. He often channeled his own artistic concerns and preoccupations through the artistic protagonists that he created in his fictions. Vencido begins with the painter positioned anonymously in a large city full of movement. The painter works in a kind of solitary rebellion, hiding himself in his work from the public. The approach, at first, seems productive. Quote, "The same loneliness that found itself surrounded in a population so large where hardly 2 or 3 people knew him gave him strength in order to work with greater enthusiasm. But he found himself alone and helpless in the middle of such activity. Encircled by such continuous movement, he considered himself an insignificant atom thrown from a tiny town into that immense sea." Being a self-conceived nobody implies a rejection of anyone else's opinion of his work. The artist feeds off this lack of recognition as a stance against the court of public taste, but without explanation, the narrator observes, he was hungry for glory. He wanted his name to become famous, circulating through the museums, books, expositions, in every corner where learned men, lovers of artistic beauty, gathered. He then begins to work with even more passion and dedication once his desire for fame manifests itself. He becomes obsessed with painting, maximizing his efforts for an extended period of time. Naturally, he eventually burns out, but not before achieving some partial successes. And now that he didn't lack strength, he studied with an amazing determination for a long time, overcoming inch by inch after an exhausting battle that rugged mountain that he had before him. When he won one of those partial battles, one in which drained all of his passive and gloomy energy, resembling a muscular blacksmith who forges day and night over the anvil, he fell exhausted, his soul full of bitterness and sadness. The narrator likens creation to hiking and blacksmithing, a less common literary trope in the later Azorin, who will avoid making comparisons in favor of a more direct style. But here, creation is like climbing a rugged mountain. Each step a strenuous, tiring, exhausting climb. Or the act of creation is like a blacksmith working day and night, hunched over the anvil, reminiscent of Christine de Pizan's comparison of poetry making to a forge. But the result for the painter in Martinez Ruiz's story of so much strenuous physical effort is burnout. We are not surprised by this result, but what may surprise us is the emotional response. The painter does not rejoice in his efforts and finished product. Instead, he is sad and gloomy. Where does this bitterness and sadness come from? Why not feel a sense of satisfaction and completion for the finished work? For the artist, creating art is not redemptive. And so here we begin to glimpse the first signs of illness in relation to artistic creation, both physical and mental in the painter, and we sense that something is just not right. The painter returns to his solitary life and begins to reflect on beauty. The narrator states that the painter takes long walks through the countryside and reads select books on aesthetics. His intellect is refined, but he has only a few friends who are as learned as he is, or thinks he is. He criticizes people who go to cafes, clubs, and promenades as small-minded and dull people, insubstantial rubbish of bankers, journalists, and politicians who speak in set phrases and think themselves to be a cultural reference. The painter sharply disparages these upper-middle-class professionals like Don Luis, the government civil servant in the previous story, and their corresponding cultural pastimes. For the painter, the bourgeoisie is a group of idlers wanting to be seen by others, living their lives superficially without contemplation, as evidenced by their formulaic speech about things, ideas and people they don't even know anything about. In opposition, he fashions himself as a deeper thinker, searching for something more profound in his life. This willful lack of connection and desire to associate with a few individuals he considers cultured enough for his company depresses him. He realizes that his opposition to the banality of the upper middle class feels useless, but makes him bitter. Therefore, the narrator observes, without more protection or assistance than the public reduced to a few learned and silent people, his fight was more arid and bitter than any other. Nevertheless, his works, his painting, makes a huge impression at his art show. The painting is marvelous. He becomes recognized instantly as a bright new painter who has bursted onto the art scene. People are amazed at this newcomer and relative no-name artist who has created such a great piece of art. He has painted a scene from chapter 36 of Don Quixote, when Lucinda, Cardenio, and Dorotea reunite circumstantially at an inn. We expect that the description of the painting would in some way comment on the story, and it does. The amazement experienced by Lucinda, Cardenio, and Dorotea reveal the truth about themselves, mirrors the same amazement of the public and critics attending the artist's art exhibition. The characters in chapter 36 were suspenseful, amazed, the three of them, while everyone at the art exhibition was lighthearted and boisterous, wondering in the height of astonishment how that dark and sullen young boy had suddenly positioned himself in such an elevated place. The painter's ability to allow the viewer to see inside the characters' minds what each one of them carried inside is the most striking feature of the work. The painter's achievement, according to the narrator, is his ability to convey the characters' expressions of astonishment and disclosure. Just as these characters learn the truth about their former misunderstandings after Dorotea delivers her stirring speech about the depth of her devotion towards Don Fernando, the painted product reflects its maker's newfound recognition. Once revealed, the painter discloses his talents to those attending the art exhibition, just as Lucinda breaks her silence, stating that she has never lied. Overheard by Cardenio, she is finally reunited with Lucinda and Don Fernando. Playing against Cervantes' love triangle and its fortunate conclusion, the modern painter in Martinez Ruiz's story, Azorin's story, fails to endear himself to his public. After his major success and upon receiving his award for it, he never returns to painting again. At first, he felt a weariness of spirit, exhausted and broken from the previous battle. Then a sweet laziness engulfed him voluptuously, inviting him to rest in the satisfaction of self-love. This is a startling passage. All at once, the painter is tired, his spirit broken, all the while basking in the public's approval of his work, the same Spanish public from which he distanced himself and disparaged for its banality. His sense of amour propre is unexpected, but makes sense given his lack of amour de soi. His victory fails to produce any new inspiration for future works. Instead, it results in a prolonged period of inactivity and personal decline. But his rest was prolonged for too long, and those colossal projects born in the heart of work, those longings for glory that he felt during the saddest days, were erasing themselves in the distance of his mind, fading like those old ancient photographs erased by light. Looking closely at this decline reveals a creative spirit and will descending into a bottomless pit, un pozo sin fondo. He does not have the strength to stop it, and yet there is a moment when he begins to work again, but quickly loses his strength. He was working for a moment, but could not go on any longer. He lacked strength, and an infinite exhaustion got the better of him, which gripped his soul, making him powerless to continue fighting. He is unable to recover his will to work and live. The public and the press have forgotten his name. He feels empty, and this emptiness encompasses him so completely that he has lost all energy and will. I mean, why do I read these things? I mean, and he, and he felt incapable, the narrator says, of making any further efforts, however supreme, to recover his willpower that escaped him, disappearing into an immense gray of overwhelming tedium. Quickly, caring relatives take him back to his hometown. He has become a hopeless case largely because of his drinking. Alcohol had almost made its work complete, the narrator remarks, continuing, the distinguished painter was a mere shadow of his former self. His face was extremely pale, his beard long and unkempt, his clothes dirty and foul-smelling, all of which revealed the hands of paid, incompetent servants who took poor care of the wretched man. Now back home in the little house where he was presumably raised, he is seen dying a slow death, indifferent to every human relation, closed off like a stone to any sensation. He spends long hours seated, completely immobile, mumbling incoherent phrases directed at imaginary beings who believed he thought were at his side. He has become delusional, wandering from room to room, grasping for furniture so he does not fall. He emits random, horsey groans and gestures as if he is fleeing from some great danger, or he imagines horrible figures throwing him into a huge fire. Right? It's just terrible stuff. He struggles to breathe and collapses into an armchair, arms tensed up, mouth open, as if he were trying to catch all of the life that was escaping out from him. Later, after these horrible moments pass, he feels better and calmer. The story concludes when finally one day his physical and mental struggle becomes so great that his heart refuses, with stubborn determination, to function. And there, in that house surrounded by such a lush and green garden, alone, helpless of all human assistance, he died. The narrator remarks that his life ended like the boring and monotonous repetition of that single note sounded by the cicada insect perched in the leaves of nearby elm trees. On a radiant day of summer, while the cicadas launched into the air from green elm leaves, their monotonous and insufferable song of a single note. The description of the insect's solitary notes emphasizes the gravity of the painter's pessimism, while the radiant sun casts even greater light on the young artist's demise. From the beginning of the story, the struggling artist creates a sympathetic yet desperate impression upon the reader about the place of the artist intellectual in modern Spanish society. We certainly hope, as readers, that the painter's health will improve and that he will continue to paint, but instead a sense of hopelessness increases in each paragraph until the final one concludes with his death. Based on the title of the story, however, Vanquished, the conclusion is not that surprising. The artist is now out of his misery, conquered by a lack of will and physical ailments. No explanation for his defeat is given, except for the excessive drinking, which hardly seems to be the cause of such extreme bouts of mental delusion and physical torment. Something else seems to be going on that lurks behind the story, that seems to strike at the psychological and spiritual, in addition to the physical life of the painter. But what exactly is it? Who is the conqueror? It's an open question, but the ambiguous forces weighing upon the character are omnipresent throughout the story, and yet they remain undisclosed. Despite the artist's tremendous work ethic and noble aspirations described at the beginning of the story, and his success at the exhibition, he is vanquished by a mysterious cultural and political force present in his immediate environment for which he has no defense. The point Azorin drives home in these stories is that the environment, our surroundings, social, cultural, political, natural, and so on, in which we live and in which we work, particularly for a writer or artist, matters a great deal. The dying painter and the civil servant live in a diseased social body, but even the most complete records of pathology cannot register its numerous victims. It slowly debilitates and eventually paralyzes its victims' minds and bodies, reducing them to creative impotence. A healthy social sphere, conducive to creativity and civil service, does not exist for these characters. Otherwise, the artist and civil servant might lead healthier lives. In these stories, such an alternative is absent, and the only possible outcome for these protagonists is physical and spiritual degeneration. As Azorin discusses in the prologue to Buscapiés, this degeneracy bears witness to the severity of Spain's belatedness and political system. For Azorin, Spain's social and cultural environment is lethal, and his aggressive criticism toward it is strikingly clear through his depiction of his character's slow demise toward death. But did his satire, this morbid satire, actually bring about any real beneficial reform? Can a literary trope such as satire move the needle? Can it really make any difference, move the needle, so to speak? More broadly, can satirists or intellectuals like Azorin and his generation really bring about change? The generation of 1898 was perhaps the most significant literary generation of Spain's 20th century. Each in their own way were literary innovators and regarded as public intellectuals. Their works ushered in a literary renaissance in Spain, for which cultural historians have termed a silver age in Spanish literature, compared to Spain's golden age of the 16th and 17th centuries. The generation of 1898 were highly recognizable figures who could easily be identified in person sitting at a cafe or in print. Miguel de Unamuno, the intellectual giant of his group, was practically a celebrity. His ideas and opinions expressed in his journalism and public lectures were highly influential. Azorin, for his part, was also widely known and read throughout Spain, particularly between 1906 and 1911, a period of intense political journalism for him. He not only was an active political writer, literary critic, and novelist, but also served 3 times as an elected representative in his home region. He also served twice as Undersecretary of Public Education. And he single-handedly reintroduced Spain's literary classics to his modern readers through a series of essays he wrote between 1912 and 1914, drawing readers back to these works. His prose poem Castilla, written in 1912, reworks some of these classics and characters in a modern idiom, reinterpreting them for contemporary readers while offering a fresh cultural identity for Spain's central region. By the time of his death in 1967, he had published numerous books on literary criticism, several novels, and over 5,000 newspaper articles. He was elected to the Royal Spanish Academy in 1924. In 1946, he received the Grand Cross of the Order of Isabella the Catholic, and in 1956, the Grand Cross of the Civil Order of Alfonso X, or Alfonso the Wise. And although students today in Spain may not read him as they once used to, his prose style has had lasting influence for Spanish writers, including even those writing today. The societal and political problems Azorin and others identified during their period of greatest literary production and reform were never completely resolved. Tensions of church and state, land equity, agricultural modernization, and deepening political polarization, not only between left and right, but within the left and within the right, only increased during the first third of Spain's 20th century. Spain's democratically elected government in 1930 that replaced the soft dictatorship of Primo de Rivera and chased off King Alonso XIII began to implement many of the reforms Azorin and others were promoting, but of course this effort was short-lived. Its civil war, fought between 1936 and 1939, stunted these modernizing efforts, replacing it with a nationalistic army general in Francisco Franco, who ruled Spain until 1975. During the war, Azorin lived in France, but he returned to Spain in the early 40s. He wrote 6 more novels throughout the 40s and remained an active writer in Spain until his death in 1967. Thank you so much for listening and coming today. Preguntas, questions?
Eric, thank you. I guess you can hear me. I'm thinking about recourse, satire as a recourse, as a response to social conditions of the kind that you were describing, changing moral sensibilities, a recognition of imperial decline, deep political divisions that seem eerily relevant today. And yet, Azorin is not as well known to international audiences as the other generation of 98 writers that you mentioned. I'm wondering if current social conditions have led to a reassessment of Azorin as a member of this generation, or in terms of his relevance to present social conditions in Spain or elsewhere.
Yeah. Part of the problem with Azorin is that he goes back to Spain during Franco. He's kind of co-opted into the Francoist ideology as a conservative writer. And many of his works that were on Castilla become this golden age imperial Spain. And so he's kind of endeared, well, he has been endeared by the conservatives during that dictatorship. The second part of the problem is that he's difficult to translate. A lot of these other writers have been translated into English and French and many other languages, so they have more of an international audience. I understand that many students today in Spain aren't reading Azorin, where they used to. I don't know if what he was saying then has to do with current issues in Spain that we all face: immigration, unemployment. I'm not sure that his concerns actually address those issues. But his prose style, the way he wrote, is still, I think he's more regarded. But like you're right, Unamuno, and the other one who still is very relevant is Ramón del Valle Inclán, who is more widely read. I know that Azorin's sort of pseudo-memoir that was written in 1904, Confesiones de un pequeño filósofo, is read by some middle school students in Spain. I understand. So some of his more memoir work has somewhat of a readership.
So, David, you mentioned sort of early on that the sort of part of the mood of this generation of writers was looking back to Spain's sort of glorious past, particularly the Middle Ages, and looking at that as a possible source of restoration renewal. But in the two works you mentioned, I mean, except for the passage in Don Quixote, there doesn't seem to be a lot of strong emphasis on that. Of course, you have to be selective in a presentation like this. But I was wondering, I mean, when you mentioned some of Azorin's later works that are sort of endearing to the conservatives, then I started to hear some more of those medieval references and glorious past, sort of that angle, right? And of course, in the 1930s, both Germany and Spain are sort of interested in the glorious past, and for similar reasons politically. Was this interest in medieval Spain like a later development in Azorin's writing, or was this already something very present in sort of his earlier 20th century writings?
That comes into play with his novel in 1902, which is called La Voluntad. And he has readings on Juan Ruiz, the medieval poet, and he's describing how he depicts the landscape, how Juan Ruiz writes in direct prose, avoids simile, avoids metaphor. And so it's in 1902, which I didn't cover here. But yeah, it's there in very clearly, and I talk about that in chapter 4 of the book I'm working on. But La Voluntad, it's there. In Castilla, there's some references as well. The work I mentioned. There's some references to the medieval poets as well. Yeah. Yeah. Liz.
I wanted to ask about if in your scholarship you have thoughts about how these male artists and writers are expressing these symptoms of depression and suicidal tendency. Often in literature, women are depicted as hysterical or, out of their mind for having similar reactions. Does that show up? Is there something kind of noble or intellectual about these malaises because they're so rooted in ways that culture and society are being kind of interfered with and through all these different things? Or, is there something gendered about if a malaise is coming from within versus being imposed upon? I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that in your work.
I hadn't thought much about gender and illness. That's interesting. He has, in a novel in the 1940s, 1925, Doña Inés. The main character, Doña Inés, suffers from melancholy. But in the 1890s, this disease seems to affect, it comes from the outside. It's very much Nietzschean. It's very general. It's very broad. It's not specific. It's not tuberculosis in the 19th century. It's not cancer in the 20th century. But it's something that's, it's a general decay. Spengler's, Klein of the West is a general malaise that affects everybody. And it's his male protagonist in the short stories. But yeah, the case of tuberculosis is interesting. Sontag's essay on illness as metaphor, where she describes the illness as tuberculosis as one that inspires artists to write as they die, and she talks about female writers in the Victorian novel. Those are specific illnesses that she discusses. This is just a general kind of vague malaise that is brought on, that is diffused throughout the society.
So David, I remember you mentioned that Azorin was kind of a Francophile to a certain extent. So I'm wondering how he was able to reconcile his, love for French culture with his own conservatism, because partially the end of imperial Spain was due to the French invasion of Spain. So how was he able to reconcile those facts with his love of French culture, and also taking into consideration that the many Spanish intellectuals, they rejected many of the ideas from the French Enlightenment that arrived to Spain, like José de Lara and many others.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how he reconciled his conservatism with.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. He argued in the 1913 essay that I referenced, any national literature must be regenerated, reinfused, reinvigorated with foreign literature. So he was open to outside sources. He wasn't as self-defensive as, say, an Unamuno was. Unamuno was Spain, Spain, Spain. Adentro, inside. Draw on our own resources, draw on our towns. Azorin did that as well. He was very much a Francophile. Read Baudelaire, read Nietzsche, loved the French, loved the French literary classics. But he didn't take that self-defensive posture, he brought it in. But critics have never really accused him of being a simple derivative literature. Right? So I would argue Azorin was able to create some kind of a hybrid. He was able to maintain an authenticity, a Spanish authenticity in his work, while bringing in foreign literature. The argument has been made that other writers had a greater tension, because for Spanish writers and any writers on the margin, who are not in the center of cultural power, are forced to, if they want to be modern, they want to be considered modern, they've got to adopt foreign methods, because what is modern is coming from the outside of Spain, not the inside of Spain. Spain's a backwater. So we've got to go to Paris, we've got to go to New York, we've got to go to Germany and bring that in. to modernize our prose. But that creates a problem because you want to write authentic Spanish literature. And so somehow that foreign modern influence then begins to threaten one's notion of national identity. And so Unamuno has a different reaction than Azorin. Valle-Inclán, very Francophile, very modernista, right? Brings in a lot of the French, but also but creates Spanish characters in kind of a French idiom. And this tension really begins, this starts in the 18th century, goes through the 19th century, and up and through the generation of 1898. Until then, Spain then, of course, cuts itself off from everybody, autarky during the Franco. But that question of bringing in foreign and modernizing and maintaining and respecting one's national authenticity is a tension there. I don't know, Azorin seems to kind of ignore that and brush it under the table. Early critics thought he was a complete copycat of, especially his early work, complete copycat of Gide or Proust is another great comparison with Azorin and the French, Marcel Proust. I think his style, I think that he writes a lot of his work in the present perfect tense. And so, as in French uses the auxiliary verb être plus the past participle. And so Azorin will do the same. He doesn't use the preterite, he'll go he hecho, ha sido. And this is very French. I think he got a lot of that from the passé composé. So, yeah. So I think he kind of sidesteps that, but he's able to somehow incorporate. Yeah, Patricia.
So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how if his use of satire evolved throughout his work, and if he relied on it as much early on as later, and then also how his worldview might have changed and how we can see that through that use. The society is infectious versus maybe something different later on.
So in the 1890s, he was young, he was rebellious, he was an anarchist, and full of passion. He softens in turn of the 20th century. Some would say he sold out. He reads Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, French source, takes an ironic distance, and becomes a bit more conservative in his political outlook, less satirical, more ironic. That's the short answer. But my class in the fall will talk more about him if you take it. I'll teach these characters here in the fall. We can talk more. We have some wine with tapas. So. Do you want to ask your question?
Go ahead. We'll have one more. So I'm curious about this change in thinking. You mentioned, I think rightly so, how some of these characters in the generation of '98 harken back to this golden age of Spanish literature, and you mentioned Quevedo as a satirist, which he didn't leave anybody escape his criticism. So I'm wondering, because we understand the golden age as an age of production, but I think that the folks from the generation of '98 found it as some sort of conservative, idealist place to live, when it was quite the opposite. Those people, such as Quevedo and others, were criticizing the social body precisely because what we now call it is la España en decadencia, la España in decline, right? Spain in decline, because they were worried precisely about maintaining this national identity. In fact, we could cite historical edicts like the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609, which is around the time that Quevedo wrote The Swindler, right? And so I'm curious, what do you think inspires these folks from '98 to look at that generation as something that probably really wasn't?
Yeah. There's a whole other side of Azorin that I couldn't get into, and that is his theory of decadence, historical decadence. And which he recognizes the very problems that you point to, that Quevedo points to, the hunger, the social insecurity, the poverty, that was really not so golden, right? And so he starts this in a series of essays that were published after Buscapiés. And I think he has a realistic approach to it, as he describes where decadence begins. It begins when Spain begins its empire. And this is where it starts to ignore national problems and starts to fight religious wars elsewhere. It starts to focus on colonizing the Americas. So I think the Middle Ages were actually more idealized for them than the Golden Age. But no. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, let's thank David.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And as he mentioned, we have refreshments next across the hall. And thank you again, Evan and Mississippi Humanities Council for your partnership. So I invite you next door. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, it was really good.
Thanks.